fact that I actually hesitate to discuss with other dietitians because there's usually a sense of judgment that comes through. Hello, welcome back to Nutrition con Sabor. I'm Krista, your Latina dietitian, and today we're diving into one of my favorite topics in the world, Mexican food history. In today's episode, we will be learning a brief timeline of Mexican cuisine and its influences, and we'll also compare Mexican food today to historical Mexican food. So let's jump in. So we're going to start with why learn about the history of Mexican cuisine. You might be wondering, if I'm a dietitian, why am I talking about food history? Well, the answers vary depending on who you are. But let's start with the healthcare provider side of the equation. As a healthcare provider, understanding history makes us more compassionate providers. It helps us comprehend the origins of food customs and guides us to address the right issues. Take sodas in Mexico, for example. Mexico has the highest per capita soda consumption in the world. This is a fact that I actually hesitate to discuss with other dietitians because there's usually a sense of judgment that comes through. Oftentimes, a dietitian or doctor will say this is just due to cultural preferences, and they might do it in a way that's kind of infantilizing. They'll say like, oh, they just love sugar. But this is something I've actually spent a lot of time looking into. I've actually done presentations just on the topic of beverage choices in Mexican American communities and the historical context for these beverage choices. What most dietitians don't know is soda consumption in Mexico dramatically increased in response to nationwide issues with water safety. When you understand this, it makes you a better healthcare provider, because one who's not informed about this history might just lecture their patients about sugar, whereas a healthcare provider who does understand the context might know to ask questions about how safe that client feels drinking water, if they prefer bottled water, or other questions like that, and really get to the root of the issue. I could talk about this for hours. I will be doing a few more presentations on this topic of water safety and soda consumption in Mexican American communities. I have 2 scheduled for next year in the spring. So if you're a dietitian who wants to learn more about this very specific topic, make sure to follow me on social media to see when I'm offering those presentations. That information will be in the description. But what about people who aren't healthcare providers? Why do they need to know about Mexican food history, or why might they be interested, besides just the fact that it's cool to learn about history? Personally, as a Mexican American, so taking off my dietitian cap for a second, exploring the history of Mexican food has been really important for my personal growth. It helped me break free from this very rigid black and white view of nutrition, and it really helped me work on my relationship with food. So that's why I incorporate small little bits of nutrition history with my clients that are interested in it, because adding that context to how we feel about food and why we make the food choices that we make is really helpful in my clients' journey. What I see with Mexican Americans in particular is knowing the enduring history of our cultural foods helps drown out diet culture noise. It's easier to dismiss fad diets when you recognize the legacy of our food culture and how that's nourished our ancestors for thousands of years. It's so much easier if someone comes up to you talking about the latest low carb diet that they're doing, to be able to just kind of compartmentalize that and not let it affect what you're doing or what you're eating, when you're like, no, I know that corn tortillas have been nourishing my people for millennia, and I know that they have always been healthy and will always continue to be healthy. Okay, so that was why. Now it's time to start talking about Mexican food history. So, or the actual what, right? What is Mexican food history? To understand Mexican food history, let's start with what are the different influences, and then we'll kind of go through the timeline. So first, who are the different groups of people who have kind of left their mark on Mexican food that we know today? The first group is the indigenous people of Mexico and Central America. There were many different groups of indigenous people across Mexico, each with their own traditions and food cultures. So when we're discussing indigenous food in Mexico, we have the most data on the Aztec or the Mexica people and the Maya culture. So for our purposes, we'll mostly be discussing what was going on with Aztec food and Mayan food, but there were a lot of other groups with interesting and unique food cultures at the time. That's just what we have the most information on. So indigenous Mexican food is responsible for most of kind of the classic Mexican ingredients that we know today, like corn, beans, squash, tomato, avocados, chocolate, chiles. The list goes on and on and on. Also, a lot of the tools that we associate with Mexican food, like the metate and the molcajete, were originally from the indigenous tradition and indigenous foodways in Mexico. The other major influence on Mexican food today is Spanish food. So the Spanish introduced most of the common proteins that we see in Mexican food today, including beef, pork, chicken, goat, all of that. And Spanish colonization is also responsible for dairy in Mexico, as well as almost all use of added fats and oils, including olive oil, which is really an astonishing fact for people, but we'll talk about this a little bit more later. But pre-Hispanic Mexican food had fat in it, but it had very little added fat, meaning people didn't really like cook their food in oil or add oil to food or anything like that. But of course, Spanish and indigenous food aren't the only two influences on Mexican food. Other cultures like Middle Eastern culture, French, German, and African food cultures all have left noticeable marks on Mexican food. These range from sugar, coffee, pan dulce, and rice. Now let's look at Mexican food and how it's changed throughout time. So first, let's start with the pre-Hispanic era, so anything prior to 1492. Pre-Hispanic Mexican food, you know, I say Mexican food, but really we're talking about all of Mesoamerica and parts of North America too, or parts of like southern US, right? We don't necessarily have the same borders today that existed back then, or vice versa, I guess. So just know that, you know, different groups of indigenous people in this region were trading with each other, influencing each other's food culture. So things I say about pre-Hispanic Mexican food may also overlap with things that we see in, you know, pre-European contact North American food or pre-Hispanic Central American food. Foods from this era used a lot of the same staple ingredients we see today in Mexican food, the ones we've already mentioned, like corn, beans, squash, tomato, chiles, and avocado. These were all the main staples. Of course, there were also a lot of fruits and vegetables that were native to Mexico that were eaten at this time, including nopales, jicama, pitaya, guava, chayote, and a lot more. In this era, proteins would mostly consist of small wild animals that could be caught. So birds, fish, small mammals, and insects. And we also saw a lot of plant-based proteins like chia seeds, beans, pumpkin seeds, or pepitas as I call them, and more. One small caveat is that, you know, I talked a lot about small animals, but turkey, which is not a small bird by any means, was a very common protein in Mayan food. And turkey mole is still kind of like the most authentic traditional way to eat mole, even though most of us eat chicken mole these days. So some Mexican dishes that are pretty firmly rooted in this pre-Hispanic era of Mexican food include corn tortillas, tamales, mole, salsa, guacamole, pozole, atole. All of those things are, you know, there might still be differences between the pre-Hispanic version of these foods and what we eat now, but they're pretty firmly rooted as coming straight from that time period with minor differences here and there. Next, we're moving on to the colonial period. So immediately after Spanish arrival in the Americas, the Latin American food system changed dramatically. The Spanish colonizers were very adamant about bringing Spanish food with them and cultivating Spanish food in the Americas. This includes most livestock we know today: pigs, cows, chicken, goats, and sheep. It also includes all dairy products. The Spanish were very intentional also about introducing wheat in particular to Latin America for their own religious needs and to meet their health beliefs as well. Perhaps most interestingly, the Spanish introduced the concept of frying food in oil to the Americas. Prior to this, oils were used rarely, if at all, in Mexican food. This means that also olive oil was a Spanish introduction. And I want to do an aside here. By no means am I saying that you should not eat these foods or should eat these foods. I'm merely just explaining how they came to exist in Mexican food. So this is when we start to see indigenous Mexican food start to resemble a little bit more the Mexican food we recognize today. So we still see a lot of these basic ingredients that are indigenous, like corn, beans, squash, but we start to see, more use of wheat, more use of dairy, more use of oil. So that's when we kind of start to see a little bit more of kind of the idea of Mexican food that a lot of us have in our heads today. So some foods that kind of represent this fusion of Mexican cuisine and Spanish cuisine would be, tostadas. It's a corn product, but it's fried in oil. Also, refried beans, again, pinto beans in particular, are native to Latin America, but then we're sauteing them in lard, and that is coming, both the pig and the concept of frying foods in oil is very much a Spanish concept. And flour tortillas as well, is using wheat flour to make a Mexican-shaped food. I also think it's important when I discuss this to point out the ways that Spanish colonizers disrupted indigenous foodways in addition to simply introducing Spanish foods to the Americas. So in addition to bringing their own Spanish foods with them, Spanish colonizers forced indigenous people to grow wheat. They diverted indigenous land and indigenous labor away from corn and towards Spanish crops like wheat for their own purposes. And then certain indigenous foods were outlawed for religious reasons. Then, after Mexican independence from Spain in the 19th century, we saw a wave of immigration to Mexico from other parts of the world, including Germany, France, Lebanon. So this period is responsible for giving us some classic Mexican foods that are actually influenced by other cultures, like pan dulce, Mexican beer. Most of the Mexican cheese-making tradition comes from this era, and al pastor. Next, we're moving on to the 20th century and onward in Mexican food. So this modern period of Mexican food history is characterized by a shift in labor. So more people are moving into cities and fewer people are working in agriculture. This means we're seeing more processed foods, more convenience foods, as there's less time to prepare meals at home and less guarantee that there's going to be someone at home to prepare it. I want to set an aside, I'm not saying that this is a uniquely bad thing. This is something that is observable. It happens to most societies over time. I'm not placing a value judgment on it. The other big theme from this era is the increase in trade with the United States and other countries. Mexican foods that come from this era include kind of an increase in processed snacks, both from the industrialization of the food system and also more trade with the United States. So things like chips, a lot of those processed snacks. Also, this is the era that's responsible for instant masa harina, like Maseca, which is not something that we think of, right? Like a lot of us think homemade tortillas is made from Maseca, but actually that was an innovation and a semi-processed food invention of I want to say the 1940s. I'll get that date correct in the caption. And then also this is kind of the era where we start to see the increase in soda consumption in particular. So now we're thinking about Mexican food then versus now. And one of the coolest things about Mexican food is how much it still resembles its ancient origins. But like all cuisines, Mexican food has evolved over time and is continuing to do so and will continue to do so. Changes in Mexican food are due to social and economic changes over time, as well as exposure to other cultures, other people, and their foodways. So here are some of the major changes we've seen in Mexican food over the years. So prior to colonization, Mexican cooking methods mostly included cooking on a comal, that griddle, and that's really, we're talking about dry cooking, so no oil being used in that context. We also saw baking in an underground oven or pit, or steaming like tamales, and boiling in the case of soups and stews. So the biggest difference here is that we've really seen over the last couple centuries this increase of frying food and using oil, while pre-Hispanic Mexican food contains fats from fish, from seeds, from avocado. Taking oil from plants, extracting oil from plants, was very rare. And that also means that frying techniques, whether they're using, fat from plants or fat from animals in the case of lard, all of that concept was introduced by the Spanish. Also, we've talked about how many pre-Hispanic Mexican ingredients are still thriving in Mexican food today, but also there are some that have kind of, decreased in popularity over the last couple centuries. In particular, I'm thinking of insect protein. You still see it, right? People still eat insects, but not to the same degree as before. And spirulina as well is a pre-Hispanic Mexican food that most of us don't even associate with Mexico anymore. We associate it with like wellness culture in the United States. But it really is a pre-Hispanic Mexican food. And so that's a really interesting thing that's kind of happened there. Also, we've seen some changes in food processing and cooking techniques, or I should say cooking tools. So many pre-Hispanic cooking tools are still common today. Think of the molcajete and the metate. These were used in pre-colonial Mexico to grind foods. And since the foods were ground by hand, indigenous people developed a processing technique for corn called nixtamalization, which makes it easier to grind. This process is a signature of Mexican food. It gives corn products their signature flavor. And it also carries its own unique health benefits that topic is, I could have like 4 episodes about it. So we'll save that for another time. But since colonization, mills have been introduced and are much more common now. You still see plenty of hand grinding on the metate or the molcajete, but you might see people use mills a little bit more often. And then also, like I was just saying, we've seen a lot of industrialization and a lot more processed foods. So that could mean, semi-instant Maseca or something like that. So we're seeing a lot less food being made at home 100% from scratch. That's due to changes in the labor force and economic systems. Is it really practical for people to be making every single thing from scratch anymore? Not so much, right? So things have just kind of changed, and people have had to change the way that they approach food alongside of it. So that was our super brief introduction to the history of Mexican food. I hope you loved this topic like I do. If you want to go beyond the surface level, I actually have 2 pre-recorded webinars about Mexican history and nutrition. We go a lot deeper into everything we talked about today. We'll go not only into, what changes happened, what did food look like in each different era, but also why they happened. I have my original Mexican history nutrition workshop, as well as the version that I made just for dietitians, which was pre-approved for 1.5 CEUs. If you're interested in either of these, please check the information. The links will be in my description.